Hello and welcome once again to the Word of the Day podcast, where useful words are pleasantly explained. My name is Jamie Silva, and let's get right into it. We're going to feature two related words today, sound and noise. But not the noun forms, i.e., what's that sound/noise over there, but rather the verb forms, which are a little more obscure but pretty useful, I think you'll find. Let's start with the verb sound. Actually, one sense of the verb is pretty common already. Sound as in, the accordion sounded out of tune. But I want to focus on a different sense of the word, one in which sound means test, gauge, or measure. And in this setting, it's usually paired with the word out, so the phrase is sound out. And here to help me explain sound, we have yet another talented voice actor, Cassidy. Cassidy, thank you and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jamie. I don't want to dilly-dally at all, though perhaps that's a different word for a different show. But may I say it's my first time on the show, and I'm excited to contribute. Anywho, on to the first capital W word of the day. Sound originally is seafaring jargon. It's a nautical term, and a very important one at that. See, one of the first rules of piloting a ship is to not run it aground, which is sort of the boating equivalent of driving into a lake. You might survive, but your transportation almost certainly won't. So naturally, ship captains are very interested in knowing how deep the water is beneath the boat. Shallow, of course, means danger.
Quite right. But how does one tell how deep it is? Oceans are notoriously murky. Lakes and rivers are seldom any better, and really without the helpful markers on the sides of pools, I, for one, would be hard-pressed to guess the depth there too, even though the water is basically clear. So, when sailing the high seas or attempting to dock in a harbor, you would find out the depth by dropping a rope into the water. A rope with knots in it every dozen or so feet, with a weight tied on the end so you know when it hits the sand or perhaps the rocks down below the boat. When it does hit the ground, you can haul it up, see how many of the knots got wet, do a bit of math to convert the knots to feet, and just like that, you know how deep it is. And you can hopefully use that knowledge to either alert the crew that everything is fine, or conversely, alert them to the fact that everything is not fine, and they need to start throwing large chests of valuable merchandise overboard in order to lighten the load and make it a little easier for them to maneuver the ship out of harm's way.
Actually, real sailors probably wouldn't bother converting the knots to feet, because the distance between the knots was a unit of measurement itself that they would have already been familiar with. Knots in the rope were placed every 2 or 3 fathoms, with each fathom being 6 feet. In fact, the very act of tossing the rope overboard to check the depth was called fathoming. They turned it into a verb, you see. And the verb fathom lives on today, meaning to understand or envision. Like, if you just don't get how your team gave up a large lead in the final minutes of the game, it's a travesty or possibly a conspiracy. The outcome is incomprehensible. That reaction shows you just can't fathom how this disaster could have happened.
Fathoming, or not being able to fathom things, can also be about the future. So you can say that you just can't fathom a world of self-driving cars. It just seems so weird and strange. But it would be nice to nap or read a book or maybe cook up a plate of sizzling fajitas on your way to work.
Right, but let's get back to sound. So, we know that if you want to test the depth of water, you sound it with a rope, known appropriately as a sounding rope. Well, the original archaic French word for this sounding rope was le sonde, and it's possible, indeed likely, that le sonde was in turn related to an older Germanic word, sund, spelled S-U-N-D, meaning the sea or the ocean. So, if you were to take the term sounding extremely literally, it means you're seeing, S-E-A-I-N-G. You're oceaning, you've turned the sea itself into a verb, and you're doing this seeing in order to test the depth of the sea.
It's all very symmetrical, very poetic, and would you believe it, speaking of the German word sund, there is a British city called Sunderland, and it's a seaside city on England's northeastern coast. And guess what country is just right across the ocean and further east?
Germany?
Well, no, technically it's the Netherlands, but right after that, Germany.
Coincidence?
I think not.
This is like one of those detective shows where they all have the evidence pictures with pins on them, like on a whiteboard or a wall, and then you string some yarn between a bunch of the pins, and after staring at it for a while and getting nowhere and sweeping all the papers off your desk in a fit of rage and possibly questioning why you ever joined the force in the first place, suddenly the yarn connections all make sense and everything fits together, and you say something like, You. All along, it was you. And you rush out of the station with your trusty but not quite as intelligent sidekick, who ultimately proves indispensable in distracting the criminal after he gets the jump on you in the climactic showdown.
Yes, Cassidy, that's right. Language is like that all the time. It just offers one adventure after another. But anyway, I think we've come a long way here, and we know the history of sound and Le Sonde and Sund and Sunderland, plus the fact that you watch a lot of detective dramas. But we're still not sure how to use sound in ordinary conversation. Well, here's how. If you want to see what your friends think about going bowling this afternoon, you might sound out your friends by mentioning, subtly and offhandedly, that bowling is fading as a social institution in America these days, which is really a shame. And also, some new lanes opened up downtown recently, and you've heard they're really nice. So yeah, maybe we should check those out.
Right. Then you pause and scan your friends' faces to see if they seem enthusiastic.
And if they are, you say, hey, you know what? I was thinking, guys, what do you think about this? What say we check them out sometime? I mean, I don't know. I heard they had a group deal this evening, and I've actually already reserved 3 lanes. So who's with me?
Right, but if they don't seem enthusiastic, you can easily brush it off by saying something like, anyway, I just heard about that, thought it was kind of funny, but I have a thing this afternoon, it wouldn't work for me anyway, so, yeah.
So, essentially, by mentioning bowling in the first place, you're floating up a balloon, as the saying goes. You're testing the waters, as another saying goes, I think traditionally in reference to the temperature of the waters. But hey, maybe it can be in reference to their depth instead, like sounding, because that's what you're doing. You are sounding out your friends.
So that's the usage. Anytime you want to say that you're floating a balloon about something, you're gathering people's opinions or preferences, that means you're sounding them out, or just sounding them. The out on the end is common, but it's not mandatory.
Let's hit a couple examples, shall we? Example number 1. Irma wanted to buy a worm farm and put it on the coffee table as a conversation piece. But after sounding her roommates on the idea, she decided it wasn't a very good one. An ant colony would have to do instead.
Example number 2. When Layla tried to sound out her personal trainer's thoughts on skipping leg day just this once, she simply laughed and doubled Layla's squat quota.
Now, there is one more word that we have to hit here just because it's related to sound, and it's also fun. The word is noise. And just as with sound, we're going to focus on the verb form to noise. This means to spread around in society information or ideas or, most likely, rumors.
The online definition of noise, the verb, is, quote, to spread by rumor or report, usually used with the words about or abroad, unquote. So you can see how this connects to sound, right? In both cases, you're introducing an idea or perhaps some information. But while sounding is focused on getting people's reaction to the idea, noising is much more about the process of spreading the idea itself.
Here's a couple good ways to think about this, because I know it's kind of a funny term. You know the phrase, word on the street, as in, word on the street is that the new taqueria downtown gives out free chalupas if you can name a Latin Grammy nominee. The question arises, how did that information get out in the first place? Why is that the word on the street? Well, if the taqueria place wanted to generate some buzz, get people talking about it, they might have secretly noised that rumor about town themselves. And now everyone wants to visit and get their free chalupa with a side of guac and cultural appreciation in the form of greater awareness of Latin Grammy nominees.
But there can also be a negative usage with noise. Lots of times, the information getting noised about is expressly meant to damage someone's reputation. Like, the most common things to get noised about are scurrilous rumors, although theoretically the rumors could be totally true and it would still count as noising.
How about some examples? Example number 1. When Bobby found out that Kevin's birthday party was on the same day as his, he devised a plan to ensure their mutual friends attended his party instead. This involved noising about the schoolyard a baseless insinuation that Kevin's parents planned to serve gluten-free walnut cake.
Example number 2. When the tale of Olaf's encounter with a coyote while backpacking was noised abroad to his relatives in Sweden, he gained a reputation as a fearless mountain man, even though the coyote had just stared at him for a couple of seconds before wandering off. Note here that instead of noised about, I said noised abroad. This just means it was noised about in a different geographic area, potentially internationally, i.e. abroad.
Well, that is it, folks, for today's episode. Thank you very much, Cassidy, for joining us. And at this point, I would like to sound out you, the listeners, for your thoughts on this program. Whatever you like, don't like, general opinions, I'd love to hear what you have to say. So you can email us at wotdpodcast@gmail.com or tweet at WOTD_podcast. If you like the show, don't forget to noise it about amongst your friends, perhaps even noise it abroad if you know anyone overseas. This has been the Word of the Day podcast. I'm Jamie Silva.